Thank you. I love that video too. Welcome. My name is Greg Gorga, Executive Director of your Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. So good to have you here tonight for Global History in the California Missions, a Sea Story by Janet Sands. You are in for a treat tonight. Very excited. I want to acknowledge all of our board members and some past presidents that are here. Can I show a raise of hands on our board members? And I know Amanda Thomas, past president. Thank you very much. Always have to acknowledge them. They sign my paycheck. Yeah, let's hear it for them. Hopefully some of you met on your way in our new Deputy Director, Jessica Tage. She's been here for 4 days, so great to have her along and on board. Yeah. And a big hand for our lecture series sponsor, Marie Morris Rowe. So this is being recorded. We generally get the lecture up on our website in about 1 to 2 weeks, and on TV Santa Barbara. And they show, is recording it, and then they show it on their station as well. So if you have friends that want to come and see it, definitely it'll be on our website. If you're on our email list, we'll let you know when it gets up there, and then you look for it on TV Santa Barbara. Let's just thank Marie Morris Rowe, because I want to make sure we get that one. All right. All right, so we have a wonderful exhibit, temporary exhibit on display through August 27th called The Lure of Lighthouses and Dancing with Waves, photography by Dan Merkel. So if you didn't get a chance to go upstairs tonight, please make sure you come up back and see that, tell your friends about it. We had a great experience with about 25 members of the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. We just got back about a week or two ago from San Ignacio Lagoon, where we go out to the reserve where the gray whales mate, birth, and nurse their pups. We were on the reserve for 20 minutes, and I kissed my first gray whale this year. Fourth one altogether, but an amazing experience. Everybody got to touch a gray whale. We are going back to the lagoon in February 26th through March 1st. Next year, 2024, if you're interested, come see me, come see Martha Dowling, our Director of Development, or look on our website. But that is an incredible experience, and I highly recommend it. It's a trip of a lifetime. Our lecture next month, April 20th, is Cargo in Question, 2 films, it's actually a films instead of a lecture, about labor, shipping, and globalization in the 21st century by Dr. May Miller-Lukethi and Dr. Charmaine Chua. And then on April 29th, we have a special event. It's a book signing and movie screening of the new book, All Hands on Deck by Will Sofrin. Will was one of the crew members at a very young age that sailed the SS Rose from the East Coast through the canal to the West Coast for the filming of Master and Commander. And we're doing that with, in partnership with our neighbor here, the new Anchor Rose restaurant. And yeah, so April 29th, it's absolutely going to be awesome. And then in May 18th, our lecture is The Mystery of the Marie by Teresa Newton-Terez. That is a true story of the sinking of a small vessel, 7 lives lost in 1960 during the Cold War, and it does have some Cold War implications in history there as well. Also very excited, a lot of you know that one of our board members, Roger Chrisman, and his wife Sarah, purchased the Mystic Whaler. We had it here in October, tall ship. We did a bunch of education programming with that. We are bringing that back in late April. And then we just finalized plans to bring the San Salvador back from the Maritime Museum of San Diego for Fiesta this year. Yes, so look for that on our website. And hopefully you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, get our emails and our newsletters. If you are not getting our emails, bottom of our website, sbmm.org. All it is your name and email address, and you can hear about all these wonderful things happening at the Maritime Museum. And I didn't even mention any of our education programs, but we continue to do Maritime on the Move, a nationally recognized education program. We just finished up marine science, about 400 students on a local fishing boat becoming hands-on scientists, and a lot more going on here. So thank you, all of you who are members of the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum, especially our Navigators Circle members, and also thank you to those of you in our flagship society that have us in your plan giving. None of the work we do is possible without your support. So thank you very much to all of you. Yes. So we are so pleased tonight to be joined by our good friend of the museum, renowned author Janet Dowling Sands, for a presentation on global history and the California missions, A Sea Story. Janet is an accomplished writer, photographer, architectural designer, and watercolorist. Her skills have been applied to recording her travel experiences in illustrated journals and in her book, On a Mission, The Real Story of California Missions, which is available in our museum store. It will be available in the store after the lecture, and she is happy to sign that copy of that if you have one after the lecture. This work encompasses a unique perspective on history shaped by extensive research and by many years of engagement with educators, scientists, and historians. Janet is a California native and credentialed teacher with a degree in art history and design from the University of California, Berkeley. As a longtime active board member of both the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University, she has spent many years working to improve science and nature education for children in Santa Barbara and to support scientific outreach for the public. With over 30 years of experience in the nonprofit world, including as director of the Roard Foundation, she has provided funding and hands-on leadership for many science-based initiatives through her extensive volunteer career focused on education, science, and nature. One of the many highlights being organizing our Santa Barbara Natural History Museum's first 2 symposia on human origins. Also an award-winning Girl Scout leader, Janet has additionally served on the boards of Greenwich Academy and Cates School. She's a busy woman. A lifelong student of history, art, and the natural world, and an extensive collector of American regional art, she is currently working to complete her next book, Collision of Cultures, A Traveler's History of the American Southwest. Please join me in welcoming Janet Sands.
Well, Greg didn't follow instructions very well, and so I don't know, my Girl Scout troop would have heard about it. Anyway, thank you, Greg. That was very generous. I don't know where you found all that stuff. I think you made a lot of it up. I want to thank all of you, by the way. I can't see you because of the light, but thank you so much for being here. Many good friends in the audience. I'd like to thank not only Greg, but Heather, Jason, Rita, and the entire staff of this wonderful museum. Being here is very special for Ed and me, and partly because it brings back memories of some favorite people, including Jean Schuyler, who with her husband Barry was, as many of you know, was instrumental in this museum's founding. I was lucky to spend many days in Hope Ranch and in the Santa Barbara backcountry riding alongside Jean, who was a fellow sagehand, who was among many things a great horsewoman and a fabulous nature guide. So here's to Jean, kind of dedicated to her. Now, and this is really cool. You can use your iPhone as a remote. Did you know that? Anyway, so I'm sure many of you attended the talk last month by Professor Andres Resendez. It's one of the history surprises that have recently been published, and it fits right into the story of the missions. New things are always turning up, and as I was saying the other night at dinner with the Jackmans, the trouble with history is there's so dang much of it. but anyway, so let me go to my first slide here. By the way, I do love that picture of the San Salvador. Now, and here's the picture of Resendez's book, just in case you haven't read it. It's absolutely wonderful. Now, this evening, we're going to travel way back in time and to the far side of the world. Now, I show a lot of pictures. Don't worry. It's a stream of consciousness. Just sit back and relax, and there will not be a quiz. You can throw tomatoes and ask questions at the end, okay? So let's start. Here's me going down the rabbit hole, by the way. So we're going to start with 3 composite slides of all the missions, just to remind us what wonderful places they are to visit, and that the mission era's architectural and cultural legacy is a big part of California's history and identity. Many mission churches still serve indigenous communities. Some are named here. Now, it's a really complex story, but we can learn much more from it if we look at everything in context, as part of the great sweep of human history that began when all our ancestors left Africa perhaps 200 to 150,000 years ago. Now, to set the stage, I'd like to use a quote from this wonderful book, The Sea and Civilization by Lincoln Payne. He starts with these words: "I want to change the way you see the world. Specifically, I want to change the way you see the world map. by focusing your attention on the blues that shade 70% of the image before you and letting the earth tones fade. Now, this shift in emphasis from land to water makes many trends and patterns of world history stand out in ways they simply cannot otherwise. The bottom line, it's really good to look at things from different perspectives. I'll just give you a sec. Can you read that? Okay. Okay. I hope Michelle approves. Okay, so here are our questions for tonight. To give the punchline first, California's Spanish missions and presidios were once very remote but strategically vital defensive outposts on the northern frontier of the first empire on which the sun never set. At its height, Spain controlled 5.4 million square miles of territory. Much of North America, in fact, South America also, was Spanish for nearly 300 years. St. Augustine, Florida predates Jamestown and Plymouth Colony by more than 50 years. Think about that. Now, excuse me, I probably talked too much before I started. Now, in the early years, though, those strategically vital outposts were not very fearsome. They were primitive and small. Each mission was manned by maybe one or two, less than a handful of Franciscan padres, and the presidios never had more than a few hundred soldiers at the most, usually more like a few dozen. Now, these drawings show the Monterey Presidio and Mission Carmel as they were in 1792, just 2 decades after their founding. What's more significant is that the missions represent what we call first contact, as the film just mentioned, when indigenous people and Europeans encountered one another for the first time. That's why we think of the Spanish period in the Americas and in California as a nexus, where prehistory and written history converge in an historical instant. So speaking of prehistory, let's dive into that for a minute and ask, what is it about humans' relationship with the sea and our species' penchant for exploration, exchange, migration, and conquest? As this piece in Scientific American titled "When the Sea Saved Humanity" explains, it's quite likely that the sea actually did save our species. A multi-year investigation led by Dr. Curtis Marion, who's shown there, of the Institute of Human Origins, whom many of you met when we had the symposium here in Santa Barbara, came to that conclusion. Briefly, here's what his team found. Around 150,000 years ago, there was a worldwide climate crisis with prolonged droughts that made most of Africa, homeland of our species, completely unlivable. There were a few places that were livable, like in caves on the coast of South Africa. Curtis's team saw much evidence that a tiny population of Homo sapiens survived that climate crisis by learning to exploit, as scientists call it, resources from the land and, for the first time, from the sea. So once the sea had saved them/us, the first modern humans left Africa maybe 70,000 years ago and in pretty short order became the most invasive species. In other words, we peopled the entire world. Now, geography and the cycles of glaciation dictated that the Americas were the last stop, the last continents to be settled by humans. So, who were the first Americans and the first Californians? That's the really hot topic in science these days, and a very contentious one. Where did they come from and when? Their descendants were the people encountered by the Spaniards when they arrived on the coast in the 16th century. And understanding what California's environment was like before the arrival of Europeans changed it completely is a big clue to how long they'd been here. I love to show these maps. These are the topography and vegetation zones in California. You can imagine what these would look like if they were of, say, Iowa or Kansas. Not quite so different. So, California's north-south orientation and unsettled geology has created a huge diversity of terrain and ecosystems. And just as plant and animal species will adapt to and exploit every available environmental niche, human groups in pre-contact California adapted to an incredible range of distinct climate and ecological zones. Now, here are some tribal and language groups shown on the map. Tribal on the left, language on the right. So when Europeans first arrived, California had one of the most diverse indigenous populations in the entire world. There were more than 300,000 people belonging to at least 80 tribal groups, with perhaps 1,000 distinct and localized triblets speaking hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages. Now here's the clue part. Linguists will tell you it takes a really long time for that kind of diversity to evolve. So, and where did they come from? Well, the science of genomics now confirms what had long been guessed, even by a Jesuit natural historian back in the 16th century. All Native Americans' ancestors came from Asia, and they carried some European genes with them as they moved across the Asian continent. But for a long time, before we had DNA evidence, archaeological evidence like the beautiful fluted spear points that you see here, found first at Clovis, New Mexico, and then at sites across the Americas, supported the widely held Clovis first hypothesis, which you may have learned about in high school or college, that the first Americans were big game hunters who traveled from Siberia overland via Beringia, which is now, of course, submerged under the Bering Sea, through ice-free corridors, there's those red lines, that opened up between the retreating glaciers about 12,000 years ago. Well, over time, a slight problem arose for Clovis first. A lot of coastal and other sites were discovered throughout the Americas and continue to be discovered that predated the opening of the ice-free corridors. Other research shows that it may in fact have taken more than 1,000 years after the ice melted for those ice-free corridors to become repopulated with the plants and animals people would have needed to survive on what would have been a very long, cold walk. I love that picture. So, but the earliest arrivals probably didn't have to walk. The evidence now indicates that starting perhaps 20,000 years ago, and these numbers change all the time, you can Google it, new discoveries happen all the time. But early mariners traveled here certainly from Asia by sea, when mile-thick glaciers still blocked an overland route, following what one team of scientists up at the University of Oregon called the Kelp Highway. It was greeted, I won't say with hoots and hollers, but with a good deal of skepticism when it was first proposed in 2007. But this theory is now pretty widely accepted, even though there are some Clovis first holdouts. Note, especially in light of what we've learned the last couple of years, it's pretty risky to say the science is settled. Just thought I'd throw that out. So anyway, and John Johnson up at the Natural History Museum explained to me some years ago that this kelp highway theory makes a lot of sense because the kelp forest ecosystem is virtually the same all the way from Japan around the northern Pacific and down the coast of the Americas all the way to Chile. The kelp forest has a calming effect on wave action. The deep-rooted giant kelp would have provided holdfast for their canoes, and it was rich in the food resources that these coastal adapted people already knew how to harvest. Ooh, okay. Anyway, I love the kelp forest. So, but we do know that there were multiple waves of migration into the Americas from Asia by land and by sea over the thousands of years before Europeans arrived. We have to remember that small and large groups of people and entire populations moved throughout the world ever since day one, probably since Lucy was a pup. Now remember this map? If this topic interests you, check out David Reich's book. He's a Harvard geneticist, Who We Are and How We Got Here, where he's set himself the task of sequencing the genome of every human population, past and present. And as he says, some of the information that he finds out just by looking at the genome is not very comfortable, like entire population replacements within a generation, for example. But anyway, it's there, and it's really interesting to read. Now, by the way, when we ask how early people came here into the Americas, here's the latest bombshell. If you even read the Wall Street Journal or a lot of newspapers, you might have read about the footprints that were discovered in 2001 at the White Sands National Monument in undisturbed layers of a paleo lake, on the edge of a paleo lake, this ancient lake, that were radiocarbon dated to 23,000 years ago. Obviously, the story is to be continued. And if you're interested, just Google White Sands footprints. Now, let's jump ahead from the Kelp Highway to the age of European exploration and find out why so much of the so-called New World, and imagine air quotes whenever I say New World, speak Spanish. I mean, why not Portuguese, English, maybe Russian, even Chinese? And why, in the very last years of their empire, did Spain put missions and presidios on the remote and seemingly profitless coast of Alta California? Well, profitless? Yeah, the Spanish expedition, the first one to reach California, as you saw in the movie, was Cabrillo's in 1542. Now, although he found the harbors at San Diego and Monterey, they found no advanced civilizations like those of Mexico, and most importantly, no gold or silver. Ironic, isn't it? Just native Californians living their best life on the beach, here that you guys, as they still do, okay? Anyway, and remote, yes, sorry folks, California wasn't always the very center of the world. During the age of exploration, it was farther from Europe than Siberia. In fact, people would rather have been sent to Siberia than here, okay? So, here's the prequel, part 1. Ever since early humans began ranging far and wide to obtain the best obsidian and chert for their beautiful spear points, trade has been the oldest impulse behind human movement. I almost wanted to say reproduction, but I mean, let's just stick with trade for now. For people across Western Eurasia, since the time of the Greeks and the Romans, it has always been about getting to the luxury goods of the Far East and of the Spice Islands. Here's the 6th century Byzantine Empress Theodora, the wife of Justinian, and her retinue, and of course dressed in fabulous Chinese silks. So these much sought after silks, porcelain, spices, and other luxury items came to Europe overland and by sea on what has collectively become known as the Silk Routes. Goods traveled thousands of miles overland and by sea, with the maritime routes actually preferred when the land routes were blocked by competing empires, warring sultanates, religious conflict, nomadic raiders, or whatever. Boats could, I'm sure you could all think of other things. Boats could carry a greater quantity of goods faster than donkeys or camels. So, but echoing the path of Alexander the Great, Rome carried on a brisk business with China from around 130 BCE, that's of course how we say BC now, when the Han court decided to maximize its profit from the, i.e. tariffs, from the cross-Asia trade and sent their trade rep to Central Asia to set it up. Now the Romans were especially obsessed, by the way, with black pepper and imported countless tons of it. You have it on your table today and don't think of it much. Here are some examples of items that traveled for thousands of years from India, China, and the Spice Islands to the Mediterranean world and Northern Europe. Now, and here are some items that went the other way and traveled to China. And if any of my horse friends are in the audience, you might be interested to know that these heavenly horses from the steppes of Central Asia were highly prized by China's military. Now, control of the trade routes changed frequently. I mean, read a history of Asia, my goodness, they changed a lot. In the actually, overland passage on the Silk Routes was safest after Genghis Khan conquered all of Central Asia in the mid-1200s, a brutal invasion that exceeded even the violence and utter ruthlessness of the Spanish conquistadors, and that's saying something. Now, the Mongol court's desire for profit then kept the Silk Road safe, well-maintained, and open for over a century. I mean, some of the empires ruling Asia, of course, were the Roman, Persian, Macedonian, Greek, Mongol, Ottoman, Russian. Now, Marco Polo took advantage of the Mongol trade window on his famous and well-documented sojourn as the guest of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, he of the stately Pleasure Dome, in the late 1200s. Khan was looking to establish relations with Venice, a trading powerhouse that had centuries of experience, and of course, Polo was Venetian, and his uncle and father who went with him. Now here's somebody, maybe you know about, maybe not, another marathon traveler and chronicler who took advantage of the Khan's trade window was the 14th century Moroccan legal scholar, or Qadi, Ibn Battuta. Battuta covered more than 73,000 miles on his pilgrimage, or Hajj, / post-college trip, which his daddy paid for. It was, literally, okay. But, of course, the Silk Road was also a conduit for disease. In the mid-1300s, the Black Death danced across Eurasia, devastating entire populations and transforming Eurasia's economies. Now, let me just go there. Polo, Batuta, and countless others also traveled on long-standing local maritime routes in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean. But the big maritime push was made by China's Ming Dynasty. In 1403, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty ordered his head eunuch. At the court, there were the Confucian group and there were the eunuchs, and they were sort of at odds with each other. These were enslaved boys who, were made eunuchs, and they became powerful at court. Anyway, this one, Admiral Cheng He, was told to assemble an enormous fleet of perhaps the largest wooden ships ever built. In 7 voyages, Admiral Cheng's intimidating 300-ship armada with 60 huge treasure ships that were at least 250 feet long, maybe as long as 400 feet, it's still debated, projected Chinese sea power and stoked demand for Chinese goods all the way to East Africa. It's a stamp commemorating it. After Cheng He's great feat, there was regime change in China. The the Neo-Confucians, became the dominant force at court. They considered commerce a kind of lowly and unworthy occupation, and besides, they found nothing of interest in the lands that Cheng visited. So they turned China's focus inward, ordered all his ships and records burned, and finished the Great Wall. Now here's a history what if for you. Cheng He's ships could probably have crossed the Pacific. They were larger and more seaworthy than the European ships of the time. They had triple hulls and all sorts of advanced features. And they certainly would have intimidated the Portuguese when Vasco da Gama arrived in the Indian Ocean just 70 years later. So, here's part 2 of the prequel. When one door closes, another one usually opens. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered the declining Byzantine Empire after a 55-day siege of Constantinople. We all learned about that, the western terminus of the Silk Road. Then they boycotted trade with the Christian West and closed the overland routes across Asia. Then European traders had to look for an alternate route to the Far East. It was Spain's Iberian neighbor. Oh, here, I forgot to show you the fall of Constantinople. Darn, here. Then it was Portuguese sailors who were best positioned to take the lead when an alternate route was needed, because Spain was still busy with the Reconquista. Throughout the 1400s, the Portuguese had been building a seaborne trading empire with the goal of reaching India by sea. Well, they'd already reached it, of course, partly by land and partly by sea, but they wanted to try to see if they could get around Africa. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, they developed advanced ships, maritime weaponry, and navigational and sailing techniques that would allow them to sail against the winds and currents, navigate out into uncharted ocean away from the coastlines, and most importantly, get back home. In these new ships, and with the Pope's blessing and a couple of papal bulls, and with their ever-increasing knowledge of navigation, Portuguese mariners conquered Ceuta on North Africa's coast. That was the first overseas conquest by a European power. And then they gradually moved down the continent's west coast, seeking a way around the Muslim-dominated land routes to the east. On the way, they established extremely profitable trade in gold, ivory, pepper, and slaves. Slaves were one of the primary things that was traded throughout history. Aside, now notice the position of the Canary Islands. It's the yellow arrow there. The Canaries, Azores, Cape Verde Islands, and Madeira are collectively called Macaronesia, like a macaroon. They were known to mariners since ancient times, but Spain and Portugal occupied and divvied them up in the 14th and 15th centuries. In the 1400s, Portugal used them as launch pads for Atlantic voyages down the coast of Africa, and soon Spain would use their Canaries for a pioneering voyage into the New World. Now, in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, which he aptly called the Cape of Storms, and the king rebranded it when he got home. With India practically in sight, Portugal's king turned Columbus down when he sought backing for his plan to sail westward. Quoting Columbus now, King John ordered the coast of Africa to be explored with the intention of going by that route to India. This was the route of highly profitable trade, and King Zhao wasn't going to be distracted by searching west for the unknown. Vasco da Gama made it all the way to India, as you can see on the map, in 1498, delayed 10 years by a succession crisis back at the Home Office. By 1514, Portugal had crossed the Indian Ocean and reached China and the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands. This became what was known as the Silk Road of the Sea, taking over those long-standing local trading networks that had existed for thousands of years. Portugal quickly established and aggressively, even brutally, defended trading bases at key strongholds in the Indian Ocean. For a time, it was a Portuguese lake. Now, how could a small country do that? Their advanced ships had superior maneuverability, and they were armed with cannons. Remember, Shanghai's fleet was destroyed. Ever wonder why the fiercest jellyfish in the sea is called a Portuguese man-of-war? Of course, later in the 1500s, Portuguese dominance was threatened by the equally aggressive mercantilist Ottomans. Now, let's go to the conclusion of the prequel. The Reconquista ends, enter Spain. Meanwhile, Portugal's frenemy, Spain, was busy bringing the Reconquista to a close, ending 800 years of Muslim occupation on the Iberian Peninsula. In January of 1492, the joint forces of Aragon and Castile under Ferdinand and Isabella defeated the last Islamic Sultanate at Granada. I like to call them Ferdinand and Isabella, Inc. Flush with their victory over the Moors, the fundamentalist Catholic monarchs believed it was their holy mission to continue their crusade against infidels everywhere, including on the Iberian Peninsula, because remember, 1492 was also the year they started the Inquisition. But war is expensive, and they were short of cash, so Spain's challenge was to profit from the lucrative East Asian trade while avoiding the Silk Road, blocked by the Ottomans, and the route south around Africa, which a set of 15th century papal bulls had awarded to Portugal. Great how the Pope just felt free to divide up the world. What was open to them then? Well, Spain could look north, but they knew there were codfish, and that didn't seem too interesting. But if they looked west, they knew that India, China, and the Spice Islands were somewhere out there, but no one knew how far or how long it would take to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So, Ferdinand and Isabella, Inc., like true venture capitalists, took a chance on a persistent Genoese navigator with big ideas, close connections to the Genoese banking cabal in Seville, it's a long story, but it's true, and his Portuguese father-in-law's collection of maps, logs, sea charts, and nautical instruments, which was second only to that of Prince Henry the Navigator. Their bet on Columbus paid off. Although he failed to find China, he ended up being sent home under arrest for bad governance after his second voyage. He did find 2 new continents. He didn't die broke, but he went to his grave believing that he'd found the Indies, or at least Cipango, Japan. Now, you might not know that the Treaty of Tordesillas and the famous line of demarcation that you learned about in high school replaced an earlier treaty called the Treaty of Alcazabas, where Spain and Portugal had agreed to divide the globe horizontally, I think I show that there, with a line drawn just south of the Canary Islands. Now, when Columbus returned from the Americas, his unintentional first landfall was Portugal. King João quickly figured out he'd been south of the line and then claimed Columbus's discoveries to be Portugal's. Well, it turns out Ferdinand and Isabella had just bought and paid for the Pope, who just happened to be Spanish, and they asked him to mediate. So a new vertical line was drawn, which later had to be moved a teeny bit further west, 300 miles actually, so Portugal would get Brazil. The native owners of the property, of course, were not consulted by the popes, who issued 6 papal bulls dividing the world up during the 1500s. Now, let's take a bit of a turn here. Here's something else not widely known, but which explains a lot. In sailing from the Old World to the misnamed New, Columbus not only changed the political balance of the world, he unwittingly kicked off the most significant biological event in Earth's history since the arrival of our species. So here's how. As your 4th grader will tell you, from about 300 to 175 million years ago, all of Earth's land masses were joined together in an ancient supercontinent called Pangaea. As Pangaea drifted apart, however, all the species on the then separated land masses of Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas proceeded to evolve separately over millions of years. Columbus's arrival in the New World changed everything virtually overnight. Long isolated plants, animals, insects, humans, and of course microbes traveled to the New World on ships and were thrown together with native species. An American species made the return trip. The historian Alfred W. Crosby called this irreversible process the re-knitting together of Pangaea, and he called it the Columbian Exchange, a name that has stuck. Europeans unwittingly unleashed disease microbes, who are listed in red here, from Eurasia and Africa onto a population that had never been in contact with those diseases, what biologists call virgin territory, where there was no natural immunity. The resulting spread of contagion decimated unprotected Native American populations and was a colossal demographic catastrophe, as we all know. Up to 80 to 90% of indigenous people in the New World died from those diseases, and it was even worse probably than the Black Death's effect on populations of Eurasia. So, the Spanish missions brought the Columbian Exchange to California. The native landscape that had sustained native people for millennia is largely gone, replaced by European crops and herd animals, leading to California's position in the world as an agricultural powerhouse. So back to the decades after Columbus. Once Spanish conquistadors had violently rampaged across the Caribbean, Central and South America, they realized they were on a new continent, but they hadn't yet made it to China. They stood at the edge of the Pacific, a daunting barrier to say the least, and the Indies were still on the other side. Now, Magellan and Elcano's terrifying 3-year circumnavigation proved you could reach the Far East by sailing west, but it was a long, long way. By the way, Magellan was Portuguese, and like Columbus, he was turned down by King João of Portugal because Portugal was making a lot of money on the eastward route around Africa. But King Philip II, great-grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, was eager to finish what Columbus had started, get to China. So he ordered Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza to send an expedition across the Pacific to set up a trading base. So in 1541, year before Cabrillo, Ruy Lopez de Villalobos sailed to the Indies and named the Philippines for King Felipe II. But his voyage ended in disaster, and he died of a broken heart in the Moluccas. That's what I read. You can imagine. So about the same time, in 1542, Mendoza dispatched our friend Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo to chart the Pacific coastline to the north and find suitable ports. He knew that a lot of sailors wanted to try and find that Strait of Anian, but he told him not to go any further north than a certain point because he didn't want him wandering off and getting distracted. Cabrillo discovered, of course, San Diego Bay, the Channel Islands, Santa Barbara Channel, Monterey Bay. He may have gone as far north as Point Arena, but on the way home, he splintered his leg during a skirmish with natives on San Miguel Island, and I can be corrected here because I hear a lot of things, and died when the wound turned gangrenous. And he is probably buried on Catalina Island, but maybe on San Miguel, and you can get me on that one later during the Q&A. Significantly, remember this slide, Cabrillo found nothing of real interest to the king or viceroy. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, California just didn't seem worth the effort and expense, especially because, as sailors know, sending ships northward against contrary winds and currents was tough. And in those days, it doomed many sailors to a horrible death from scurvy. So there was no Spanish settlement of California yet, although the strategic imperative was about to surface. Now, if you attended last month's talk by Professor Resendez, you learned about the Basque friar mariner who, with his unsung cohort, the Afro-Portuguese pilot Lope Martin, played a big part in finally answering the question of why Spanish missions and presidios were established in California. Oh, I don't do that yet. Goodness, he's still a young man. He was one of the few survivors of the doomed 1525 Loaiza-Elcano expedition to repeat Magellan's circumnavigation. Elcano died of scurvy on that trip, and Urdaneta was captured by the Portuguese and marooned for 8.5 years in Southeast Asia. While there, he didn't waste his time. He learned the Malay language, chatted it up with a lot of mariners, and acquired a deep knowledge of the region's winds, currents, and weather patterns. He finally made it back to Europe as a prisoner on a Portuguese ship. Understandably tired of the sea, he returned to New Spain and became a monk. Well, poor Urdaneta, it was not to be. Later, though, he got some years in the monastery. In 1564, King Philip II ordered the aging friar mariner out of retirement to lead an expedition to the Philippines, which Villalobos had claimed in 1541 but had failed to colonize. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi was chosen to be the colony's adelante, or governor, the new colony. So there they are. Now, once they got to the Philippines, by the way, that's a lot easier than getting home. Urdaneta and Legazpi soon learned that the islanders over there had been trading with China for centuries. Foreign ships were not allowed in Chinese ports, but Chinese junks came to the Philippine Islands, as they were henceforth called, every year, bearing those coveted luxury goods. And it turned out there was a huge demand in China for silver, the basis of their currency, as the Ming Dynasty had run out after crashing their currency a bunch of times. Spain had a windfall of silver from the New World conquests, so this was like hitting the mother lode, pun intended. China's trade had always been Spain's goal, and now there it was at long last. But all they needed was a way to get back across the Pacific to New Spain so they didn't have to sail west through that Portuguese lake. The Pacific Ocean's patterns of winds and currents, shown here, had foiled all previous attempts. You may have heard last month that Urdaneta, from discussions with the native mariners while marooned in Asia, thought the trip to back to America, called La Vuelta, was possible if one left early enough in the year to miss the North Pacific's dreaded seasonal typhoons, if you followed the Japan current northward, and then went eastward into the North Pacific Gyre. He had undoubtedly discussed this with the fleet's other pilots. I think there were 6 total. So Urdaneta departed on the flagship. I think there were 5 in the fleet that sailed across. He departed on the flagship San Pedro on June 1st, 1565, blissfully unaware that Lope Martin, piloting the fleet's smallest ship, the San Lucas, which had become separated from the fleet on the way over, had threaded his way through the archipelago and headed into the North Pacific over a month earlier. Lope Martin reached Navidad on August 9th, 1565. Urdaneta arrived at Acapulco 2 months later on October 8th. Although they didn't travel on the Kelp Highway, both navigators follow the same pattern of winds and currents as California's first arrivals thousands of years earlier to get back to North America. And I think that's a very cool connection. As a result of their great achievement, the Manila galleon trade, the real beginning of globalization, was officially launched in 1571. This enormously lucrative enterprise allowed Spain to expand its empire and support the militant Catholic Church as it battled the Protestant Reformation. You can see the goods brought back on the galleons, sometimes on display at both the Old Mission and the Presidio. I hope they'll bring them out again. But it was a 12,000-mile trip back across the Pacific, with no water or food stops and a lot of pirates starting to lurk around out there. Galleon captains really needed sheltered ports on the California coast, which ultimately led to the founding of California's missions and presidios. Suddenly, California was strategically vital to Spain, but amazingly, it took over 200 years to get the project going. Well, so here's the question. Come on, go. Now, about that time gap, the galleon trade starts in 1571, but Spain doesn't put settlements here until 1769. Come on. Why the huge time gap? Mission docents tell me that they are frequently asked that question and aren't sure how to answer, so I help them out. Well, first of all, rule number one, or reason number one, there were 200 years of war in Europe. Religion's always a great excuse for going to war, it's still used, but you can always follow the money. The Protestant Reformation, which began about 1517, kicked off conflict throughout Europe, devastated Central Europe for a long time, and there was fierce competition for the new global trade routes. Further, an intense rivalry developed between England and Spain, starting with Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant, of course, and her fanatically Catholic brother-in-law, Philip II, who was ordered by the Pope, basically, to depose her. Well, it didn't help that Sir Francis Drake, also known as El Draco, the Queen's pirate, or that means the dragon, was exploring the Pacific, capturing a lot of treasure-laden Spanish ships and sacking Spanish ports in the Caribbean. Philip II, understandably upset, responded by launching what he called the Invincible Armada in 1588. Although outnumbered, the English won, much helped by Drake and with luck with the weather. Meanwhile, back in Mexico City, the wheels of Spanish bureaucracy were creaking along slowly. In 1595, they ordered Sebastian Cermeño to chart the coast on his way back from Manila. He was a galleon captain. He left too late in the year, not following Urdaneta's advice, and lost his ship, the San Agustin, in a winter storm near Drake's Bay, which, by the way, is probably in Oregon, not Northern California. There's a book about that was just published. It's really good. Here's the wreck of Cermeño's ship. And by the way, these bits of Ming porcelain washed up on shore, and apparently the Indians incorporated them into their pottery in baskets. I tried to find pictures of that. It's hard. Then in 1602, Sebastian Vizcaíno, one of Cermeño's officers, was sent to chart the coast. Vizcaíno succeeded. He not only charted the coast, but renamed just about everything on it, disregarding the place names previously bestowed by Cabrillo and Cermeño. Like all captains, he lost many men to scurvy on the long voyage. But he did write a glowing description of Cabrillo's Bahia de los Pinos, renaming it Bahia de Monterrey, after his viceroy. Well, that was real super schmoozing, but why was there no immediate follow-up? Well, I love this. Little political skullduggery went on down in Mexico City. It wasn't just war in Europe that caused the delay. There's a great article in the 1920 Southwestern Quarterly by Chapman. Monterey might well have been settled by 1608 rather than 1770. After Vizcaíno returned, the king ordered the viceroy to make him captain of the next year's galleon and to survey Monterey for a planned settlement on the way home. He told him he was going to get supplies after that and settlers and just get it done. But this never happened. Viceroy Monterey, the Count of Monterey, was transferred to become Viceroy of Peru. His wily and quite corrupt successor, this guy with the incredible collar, the Marquis de Montesclaros, reversed the king's order and gave the lucrative galleon post to one of his cronies. He got Vizcaíno out of the way by appointing him mayor of a remote little village, but Vizcaíno's cartographer fared much worse. He was tried on trumped-up charges of forgery and hanged. Madrid was quite unhappy. Even though the king himself, and it was now Philip III, ordered that Vizcaíno be made captain of the 1607 galleon, Montesclaros claimed, the mail was late. The order just didn't get there in time. Besides, Vizcaíno left. And he waged a relentless campaign to shoot down the Monterey project. And finally, the Council of the Indies got tired of hearing him whine, and they got busy elsewhere, and he finally succeeded in just torpedoing the project. So Vizcaíno was sent off on a wild goose chase. Spain turned her attention to Europe once more, and California's native people got a 150-year reprieve from colonial invaders. That was the good part. So at long last, missions and presidios in Alta California. By the late 1700s, however, defensive considerations finally forced Spain to come up with a plan to settle those long-claimed ports on the coast of California. Russian fur traders were moving, that's Vitus Bering, by the way, with one of his fellows. Russians were moving down the coast, ordered by Catherine the Great. The hated English were still prowling around the Pacific, trying to claim land, and galleons still needed ports after the long Pacific crossing. So what energetic soul down in Mexico City finally put this plan in motion? I don't know if you've ever heard of the Bourbon reforms, but José de Galvez, New Spain's visitador or inspector general, was sent over to implement the Bourbon reforms, and he stepped in to fix the 200-year delay in settling Alta California. He was one of the mission era's most interesting characters, an Enlightenment-era intellectual, a brilliant lawyer, educated at Salamanca, seriously bipolar, and an 18th century practitioner of realpolitik. Although a tough bureaucrat, he envisioned an open democratic society in Alta California. He deeply disagreed with the Franciscans' rigid beliefs and medieval practices and their insistence that native people be gathered into mission compounds. But the realistic Galvez just couldn't muster enough Spanish settlers for what was still a very remote territory. Since the Jesuits had been forcibly ejected from New Spain, that's another intriguing story you can look up, the Franciscans were the ones on duty. So Galvez selected Gaspar de Portola and Junipero Serra to lead a sacred expedition. Together, they carried out his orders to implement Spain's final imperial project in the whole empire, the colonization of Alta California. And here is the 1770 dedication at Monterey. Side note for you sailors, okay? By the way, oops, go back, come on. That's the trouble with using your phone as a remote. For over 2 centuries, all the early explorers and galleon captains, and even Sir Francis Drake, missed one of the world's greatest natural harbors. It's really hard to see from the sea, and remember, captains hated to get too near that rocky coast. It was stumbled upon by Portola's land party in 1769. The first ship to enter the bay was Juan de Ayala's Spanish supply ship, San Carlos, on August 5th, 1775. Now here's a map of all the missions and presidios, 21 missions, 4 presidio districts, built between 1769 and 1823, with the last one actually done in the Mexican era. In the early decades, few outsiders ever saw these tiny outposts, but we do have some rare first-hand reports and a few images from 18th century scientific voyages. These were enormously costly government-sponsored expeditions in an era when Europe's sea powers were competing for scientific discoveries and global trade routes. Here's Louis XIV consulting with the Comte de la Pérouse, who was a hero of the American Revolution, like Lafayette. He led a scientific voyage for France. His official artist recorded their reception at tiny mission San Carlos, and by the way, La Pérouse had some fairly unflattering things to say about what the condition of the Indians at the mission. Here's a fun fact for you, and a what if and a half. The 16-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte applied for this expedition but was rejected. But Pérouse's ships and their crews were tragically lost at sea. That could have been Napoleon there in the water. Pérouse did send copies of their journals, notes, and sketches back to France from Australia on a British ship before disappearing into the South Pacific. In the where were we? Here we are. In the 1790s, Alejandro Malaspina led a Spanish expedition to explore the world. Very expensive expedition. I mean, they would outfit the heck out of these expeditions with everything they could think of, because these sea powers were just trying to prove that they really had what it took. So his shipboard artist, Jose Cardero, made these views of the Monterey Presidio. Remember, Monterey was, the main port at that time. And so there's the Presidio from outside and then inside the courtyard. And then finally, George Vancouver's 1791 circumnavigation had an artist on board, and he made these views of the Monterey Presidio and Carmel Mission in 1792. Now, the beautiful stone church that you see today in Carmel wasn't started until 1793, 9 years after Sarah's death. So Sarah never saw it. It looked like that when he was there. Now, here's a little known connection for you. I can usually surprise most people with this one. Because the California missions were founded at about the same time as our country, I mean, I'm writing the date 1776, and then I thought, went down that rabbit hole, and I thought, well, what was Spain's attitude toward the faraway English colonies' fight for independence? Well, most Americans don't know that Spain, although a monarchy, helped the American rebels in their fight against the English monarchy, at least as much as the French. Now, why would they do that? Well, let's head back to the other side of the continent for a few minutes. After centuries of war, Spain really hated the Brits, especially when they lost Florida and a lot of trading rights in the Caribbean at the end of the 7 Years' War, which in the Americas was called the French and Indian War. The hero of this episode is this fellow, Bernardo de Galvez, who is Viceroy José's nephew. He was a brilliant general, popular, charismatic, had a beautiful Creole wife from New Orleans, and was one of only a handful of people, I think 8, to be made an honorary US citizen. This happened during the Obama administration. Galveston, Texas was named for him. Here's why. Oops. Now, take a look at this map of the colonial South in 1779, showing areas controlled by Britain and Spain. As the American Revolution began, José de Galvez, who is now Viceroy of New Spain, wanted the British out of the Mississippi Valley. By the way, the Spanish territory is kind of orangey, and the English territory is sort of pale. Come on. All right. So anyway, Viceroy José de Galvez, he wanted the British out of the Mississippi River Valley. He wanted them out of Florida. He wanted them out of their forts on the Gulf Coast. Okay, and he wanted Florida back, actually. General Bernardo de Galvez, who was now the the Spanish governor of Louisiana, got the assignment. Assembling an army of Creoles, free blacks, American Indians, and Spanish regulars, and anybody else who would sign up, Bernardo drove the British from Florida, from their forts on the Gulf Coast and in the Mississippi River Valley. By the way, he had to deal with 2 hurricanes to do this. Then Washington only had to fight on one front. Spain also helped the American rebels with spying, covert ops, arms shipments, and by channeling cash to them via money laundering, with funds raised in part by taxing the California presidios. And Jerry, you can challenge me on that. Anyway, now, then, where's my friend Saavedra? Furthermore, the Spanish finance minister, Don Francisco Saavedra, another practitioner of realpolitik, Henry Kissinger would have been proud, raised 500,000 silver pesos in a hurry by floating a bond with wealthy Cubans to pay to send the French fleet of Admiral Comte de Grasse up to Yorktown. Comte de Grasse was going to sail back to France because his money to pay his troops and supply his ships was stuck somewhere out at sea. Now, Saavedra figured that out, and he really wanted the Comte de Grasse to go to Yorktown to help the American rebels, so he raised the money. And without his help, the pivotal battle at Yorktown, and in fact, the revolution itself, might well have been lost. A great source for this wonderful story is Nathaniel Philbrick's fairly recent book, In the Hurricane's Eye. It's very easy to imagine a different outcome for the revolution if the Spanish had not helped. As John F. Kennedy once observed, we Americans just don't know enough about our country's Spanish history. So anyways, we began by saying it all goes back to the Silk Road. One historian observed that it was the appetite for foreign goods that brought East and West together, driving economics and the growth of nations. The ancient impulse of human societies to establish and protect their trade routes, and of course to tax and profit from them, drove the age of exploration. In fact, the map of the United States owes everything to this same impulse to connect East and West. When General Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West, I believe partly guided by Kit Carson, marched across the continent in 1846 and 47 to wrest the Southwest from Mexico, which also was thought to be a pretty profitless region. It was to satisfy the clearly stated desire of President James K. Polk and other expansionists back east to annex the entire Southwest and to get to California. This would forge an unbroken overland link to California's ports in order to profit from the Asia trade. I looked at Polk's 1848 address to Congress, and he specifically mentions China. Now, during COVID, of course, we all remember the 50-plus container ships that were lined up outside the entrance to the huge man-made port of LA and where they came from. So the colonial era, it's kind of a fraught topic today. I mean, pretty sensitive on university campuses especially, but I think it really helps if we consider the context of thousands of years of human exploration, trade, migration, colonization, and conquest, but also of discovery, innovation, accommodation, intermarriage, inspiration, survival, and courage. And the fact that all humans everywhere are close relatives in the same human family, as our friend Donald Johanson, who discovered Lucy, likes to say when he gives talks to students, remember kids, we're all Africans. And the African-American kids in the audience go, yeah, we're all Africans. So we can encourage students and remind ourselves to learn more, judge less, and that history is fun, interesting, and important. And I love this Enlightenment era quote from Spinoza. And regarding the subtitle of my book, my anthropologist friends, who are really big fans of wine, tell me that we humans have been settling differences over food and wine forever. There's the subtitle of my book, Wining and Dining Through History. And here is the Stone Age recommendation for wine pairing. Let's see. If it tries to eat us, serve with red. If it runs away, serve with white. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so here we are. We're going to do, I promised a quick look at the missions. I know I've taken a lot of your time, but let's do a 4-minute road trip that I call a 4-minute Mission Academy Awards, okay? The first is San Diego de Alcala. Visit at Christmas time. They have a fabulous stand of aloes out front, and they're great to see in bloom. The last, the one that was built in the Mexican era without permission of anybody, but the priest thought it was a good idea, is San Francisco Solano in Sonoma. See their wonderful collection of mission watercolors done in 1906 by Chris Jorgensen. The biggest is San Luis Rey de Francia in Oceanside. It was built to hold 1,000 people and is the only mission church with a dome, only surviving mission church with a dome. The smallest, and one of the most beautiful, I think, is San Luis Rey's Asistencia. Now, Asistencias were little assistant missions that were meant to have a big agricultural operation to help support the missions and presidios. Anyway, it's San Antonio de Paula. It's the only original Asistencia and the only mission in the system to continuously serve its local Indian community. I love the interior. It was painted by the Paula Indians, and the incredibly beautiful garden with a school on the side. You can hear the kids' voices. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place to visit. Now, the most picturesque ruins, undoubtedly, are the Great Stone Church at San Juan Capistrano, destroyed by the Great Earthquake of 1812, and in that year, Santa Barbara was destroyed or damaged badly by an earthquake. Only 6 years after it was completed, killing 40 people who were at Mass inside. Now, take binoculars when you visit, because there's some great remnants of painted decoration up in the chancel arches. Now, the adjacent small Sarah Chapel survived the earthquake and is the oldest adobe building in California. Speaking of earthquakes, the most miraculously preserved mission would have to be Mission Dolores in San Francisco. It's the only mission-era building to survive the great San Francisco earthquake and fire. Look at the big cathedral next door, it did not make it. Now, the most different is Mission San Gabriel Archangel. It looks like the Cathedral of Cordoba, Spain, because the padre in charge of construction was from Cordoba. And by the way, the Cathedral of Cordoba was formerly a great mosque. Now, I didn't include the picture, which I should have. During COVID in 2021, this mission had just been restored and was severely damaged by an arsonist fire. Donations were sent in from around the country, the state, and the world, in fact, and it's been mostly restored. I think someone here knows, but I believe it's been reopened and the restoration is almost complete. That was a real tragedy. So, of course, the most classic would be Mission Santa Barbara, with its symmetrical facade and a portico straight out of a Roman book on architecture by Vitruvius, which just happens to be in the Mission Archive Library. So please make an appointment to go see the Mission Archive Library. They have many, many treasures. Now, the only surviving presidio in California is, of course, Santa Barbara's. We're lucky to have it protected within the Presidio State Historic Park. This amazing 30-year project was undertaken by a team led by Dr. Gerald Jackman, who's here tonight, and was recognized with 2 visits by Prince Felipe of Spain, who became King Felipe a few short months after his 2013 visit. And by the way, be sure to read and buy Jerry's wonderful new book about this amazing community project and its restoration team. It's available everywhere now. Mission headquarters, where Father Sarah is buried, is of course the Church of San Carlos Borromeo in Carmel. Its catenary arches are unique in the mission system. You know what a catenary arch is? It's when you take a big chain and you lift it up, and it's the natural curve that happens when the chain is lifted up from 2 ends that are apart. Anyway, now we have a lost mission in California. It's the Asistencia de San Luis Obispo, Santa Margarita de Cortona, which was thought to have crumbled away, but was found hidden inside a huge barn on the Rancho Santa Margarita. There it is. And I thank the sagehands for this find. We were riding on that ranch when we got a chance to see this. The biggest surprise in the mission system would be that the austere, completely unadorned exterior of Mission San Miguel does not in any way prepare the visitor for the spectacular interior, painted in delicate natural pigments by Mission Indian artists in collaboration with Esteban Carlos Munraz of Monterrey. I love this mission. The most fortunate undoing of a remodel would be Mission San Luis Obispo, with its New England-style steeple removed. And that was, by the way, the first use of, they did that to all the missions back then, first use of mission tile. The most bell tower design attempts would be Mission San Juan Bautista. The pointy one on the right is in Alfred Hitchcock's film Vertigo. Remember that? You know, the one they jumped out of, I think? Anyway, and of course, the most authentic mission atmosphere, maybe you've all been there. If not, you should go immediately. It's Mission La Purísima Concepción in Lompoc. Once fallen into complete ruin, it was destroyed by an earthquake and fallen into complete ruin. It was rebuilt with historic accuracy by the CCC in the 1930s. It's now a state historic park, and they have historic reenactments, historic breeds of farm animals, and miles of trails. And this one, oh, there's the beautiful exterior as it looks now. There are the animals. And this one's for Ed. Because sometimes I would steal Ed's horse and I would go on trail rides with my friends up at La Purísima. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Vaya con Dios, patches again. And I'll be glad to take your questions, eruptions of indignation, as one podcaster says, and hear what I got wrong. Thank you so much. So, shall I leave my question slide on there? I can leave this one on while we're doing it. It's that wonderful 1823 map that I found that the Library of Congress has, and it just has all the missions on it. Okay. Yeah, okay, well, it was Spain's, and then there was this kind of silly, this kind of sneaky land deal, because Napoleon later, of course, took it from Spain and then sold it back to America, which he promised he wouldn't do, but he needed the money. But during the Revolution, everything west of the Mississippi was still claimed by Spain. In fact, when Lewis and Clark were dispatched by Thomas Jefferson to explore and sort of map what he'd bought, the Louisiana Purchase, nobody really knew exactly what the topography was, how big it was, how far it was. But Spain sent people up to try and intercept Lewis and Clark and arrest them, because it was still considered Spanish territory in 1803. New Orleans and St. Louis, I'm sorry, right now I would have to refer to a part of my brain that I haven't turned on right now, but obviously it was part of Spain. Bernardo de Galvez was the Spanish governor of New Orleans. And remember, there was a lot of change of ownership of that part of the world. I mean, Florida was Spanish, and then British took it in the 7 Years' War, and then Spain got it back again just briefly. But at this point, Spain's empire was really declining. They were having a very hard time hanging on to their New World possessions. And of course, there was war over in Europe, and Napoleon was broke. So bottom line is, the expansionist Americans got it all. And I'm sorry, I'd be glad to look that up and give you a more accurate timeline. Okay. So Jerry, what did I get wrong about the Presidios? Sorry?
Was there a mission in Soledad?
Thank you, because I'm listening to this motor back here. Yes, there absolutely was. And I'm sorry I didn't show all the missions. I was told to keep my talk to a certain time limit. That's why I didn't do the complete mission tour on this particular talk. But there's a wonderful mission in Soledad, and it's one of the ones that had almost crumbled completely away. It's right at the foot of the Santa Lucia Highlands. It's been restored, and it's a very, very beautiful place. And like La Purísima Concepción, it's one of the few missions that retains mostly its mission era atmosphere. I guess the other one would be the one on the cover of my book, San Antonio de Padua, which has been protected because it's on the Hunter Liggett military base, and there's never been development around it, which was formerly a Hearst ranch. But yes, Soledad is there, and it's been restored.
One more, right, Michelle?
I think you should mention that many of those paintings that you showed, you did.
Oh, well, I mean, it was cheaper than hiring somebody. Anyway, thank you very much. I mean, it's such an interesting part of history, and I hope that when you go visit the missions and the Presidio, you might just realize how connected they are to that entire impulse of people to move around the world and to trade with each other, going back thousands of years. And sometimes we just don't think of that when we go to our cute little missions that are so picturesque. Anyway, thank you very much.
You're sliding behind you. Let me slide in there. Janet, we have a little gift for you.
Oh.
Thank you very much. Don't forget, if you don't have her book, it is for sale in the store. She is going to sign those. Actually, Dr. Jackman's book is for sale in the store. I think we have it in there as well. And thank you all for being here tonight, and we hope to see you back here at the Maritime Museum very soon. Have a great evening. Safe home.